Everyone wants to be happy. It's much better to be happy than to be miserable. But what exactly is happiness? Is it when you got a high score? When you had 8 hours of sleep? Or when you finished a book that has been on your shelf for years? This is what Aristotle would like to answer in his book, Nicomachean Ethics, offering a defense of the idea of eudaimonism, or human flourishing or happiness, which is achieved as a result of human choice in search of excellence and the good life.
Good day, everyone. I am Alyssa, and together with Wennamae, we will be presenting Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Books 1, 2, and 10. The study of ethics is the philosophical discipline that deals with morality, what is good and what is bad for a person, which in turn governs their character and actions. Aristotle, in his book Nicomachean Ethics, seeks to answer what is the morally right thing to do and why is this morally right thing needed to be done. But first, let us get to know who Aristotle is. Aristotle's vast contribution in the study of philosophy has led him to be known as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. More so, one of the 2 greatest philosophers in antiquity, along with Plato.
In the study of ethics, he has contributed 2 treatises, Eudaimonism, named after his pupil Eudaimonis, and Nicomachean, named after his son Nicomachus. Among the 2, as said earlier, the subject of inquiry for today, and one that we will delve deeper into, is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle begins his discussion in Book 1 by identifying what is good for humans, or simply, the human good. He says that all human activities point to some good. This good is said to be the thing at which all things are aimed at, or in simpler terms, the good is the end that we pursue in every activity. However, not all ends are the ultimate or final end, but rather, some are only subordinate or means to further ends. The means are termed activities, while the further ends are products. These means or activities are wanted because it gets or leads us to the ultimate end that humans aim for. For example, a student studying in a university is aimed at earning a degree in their program of choice. However, earning a degree is not the final end, but rather a mean in achieving a higher purpose, such as working as a professional in the field. This professional work is, again, a mean to further ends such as earning money. And earning money is pursued for another goal, which is to buy necessities and wants. From this scenario, we can see how every activity we do has a purpose. However, if these just keep on going, such that every activity we pursue is for the sake of another purpose, Aristotle says that the process would just be infinite, and humans will achieve no final end. And Aristotle says that when this happens, everything we do is just empty and pointless. Thus, there must be a complete or final goal that all humans pursue in life. This end is something that we must desire solely for its own sake, and not of another, and this is called the chief good for human beings. In identifying this good, Aristotle puts out 2 characteristics that it must possess. 1, it must be something final, and 2, it must be self-sufficient. Ang ibig sabihin ng final in this context is dapat once you have this good, then it's done. There are no further steps that we need to take. While self-sufficient in this context refers to the good that does not require anything else. Aristotle mentioned that the one thing humans want for its own sake is happiness, and that everyone already agrees with this notion. However, the problem now is that the definition of happiness is different for every individual. It has been agreed upon that happiness is what we aim for, but there is widespread disagreement on what happiness truly is. Aristotle goes on to say that there are 4 known or popular theories of happiness, and these are pleasure, honor, wealth, and possession of virtue. A person's understanding of what is good comes from the life they lead. Thus, it can be said that whatever defines happiness for an individual reflects how they live their lives. We start with the first theory, which is pleasure. Pleasure, as Aristotle says, is one suited for the vulgar types of men, or beasts of some sort, or those who love the life of enjoyment. However, Aristotle thinks that pleasure as the final end is something unsophisticated, as humans are more than one who leads the life of desiring pleasure for itself. Aristotle then counters the idea that honor is happiness. Although honor allows one to have good reputation, this cannot be the most final good that one desires, as honor comes from and depends on other people, and this can be taken away from a person at any time. Moving on, Aristotle says that wealth cannot be the happiness or end we are aiming for. Katulad na lamang ng example kanina, we desire the life of money-making because we have further goals that we want to achieve. In this case, wealth is only a means to the ultimate end of life. Lastly, Aristotle says that the possession of virtue cannot be said as happiness or the chief good that we all desire, as the mere possession of this trait does not lead to anything at all. Now that we have explained how Aristotle rejected these four theories, we will move on to discussing what Aristotle defines as happiness or the chief good for all human beings. Aristotle says that for happiness to be the chief good, it must be assessed in relation to the function of man, as what is good resides in their function. This function must be distinctive and unique to the person, and is not shared with any other being. And whatever this good is one that allows the person to perform its function. But what then is the function of man? We know and have already tackled before that the function of man, and one that differentiates it from other beings, is its possession of reason, making it a being exercising rationality in any action. Aristotle then says that performing activities with rationality is the same as exercising virtue. Kaya nga sabi kanina, Aristotle contends the idea that the mere possession of virtue is happiness, or the chief good, kasi one who acts in rationality is one who exercises and does not merely have virtue. From these ideas of Aristotle, it can be concluded that happiness is exercising virtue. All these ideas can be simplified into these points. 1. There must be some end that we desire only for its own sake. This end is said to be the chief or final good for human beings, which must both be final and self-sufficient. Number 2, happiness is said to be the thing that we want for its own sake. However, there are varying viewpoints on its definition. 3, for Aristotle, the good is what allows a person to perform their distinctive and unique function, which for human beings is reason or rationality. Number 4, happiness is the good at which all things are aimed, and one which can only be achieved through the exercise of virtue in accordance with reason. In essence, happiness for Aristotle is the life of virtue. Aristotle ends his discussion on Book 1 by leaving that happiness is the life of exercising virtue, and he mentions that virtue is categorized into two, namely intellectual and moral. Intellectual, as it is defined in the book, is concerned with philosophic wisdom and understanding, while moral pertains to what is right or wrong and ideas like liberality and temperance. As we move to Book 2, Aristotle first focuses on moral virtue. By definition, moral virtue pertains to the state of character that is expressed in morally good actions with morally good purposes. Rather than temporary and passing feelings, these are persistent or constant patterns of behavior in a person. As we go on with the discussion of Book 2, we will further elaborate on its deeper meaning. Like all virtues, moral virtue is not natural to people. It is not an innate characteristic that we are born with. Rather, humans are granted by nature with capacities to receive virtue, which are actualized or made perfected by habits. In simpler terms, nature and nurture. For background, character and habit both come from the Greek word ethos or ethics, which leads us to the idea that Aristotle points out. The best way to form character is through habitual practice. Ika nga, someone becomes brave by performing brave actions. One becomes just by performing just actions. If we apply it sa ating experiences in life, pwedeng ma-relate ito sa math or any other subject or skill. We become better by consistent practice. Sabi nga, practice makes perfect. The same is true with virtue. It is a learned characteristic of man that is best formed through habituation. Moreover, it is important to remember that any characteristic, and in this case virtue, can also be destroyed by the same means. For instance, bad piano playing can form bad pianists through repetition. From this, we can get the idea na for one to gain virtue, it is indispensable to practice it consistently, as virtue is acquired through the actions itself. Kung babalikan nga natin ang Book 1, sinabi ni Aristotle na the mere possession of virtue does not lead to anything, kasi we must actualize it through our actions. Kaya nga rin sinasabi na our habits determine our character, kasi it is in how we act that we form the patterns of our behavior. Moreover, sinasabi na hindi lamang ang actions ang importante na makita, but also our attitude that comes hand in hand with our display of character. In our discussion of virtue, it is said to be tied sa feelings, and our feelings are related sa pleasure and pain. Thus, in exercising virtue, we must also respond to both pleasure and pain accordingly. Maliban dito, virtue is focused on the motive instead of efficiency. Hindi lang sapat na ginawa natin ang virtuous actions, but it must have the right reason or intention. More than this, Aristotle points out that a truly virtuous action requires a person to be in the right state of mind, which is related sa function of man na rationality. One must have reason to exercise virtue as we have established in Book 1. Ibig sabihin lang nito na a person must decide on acting virtuously, know how to do so, and be firm in their decision. And before we move forward sa next points ng book na to, let us recap na 1. Moral virtue is not innate, but rather a learned character that we form through consistent practice of right actions. Number 2, actions are not merely enough, but also the attitudes na we exhibit in practicing these, such that we respond to feelings of pleasure and pain appropriately. And 3, virtuous actions require the right intention and must be done by a person in the right state of mind or in using reason. And now that we have established those points, let us now proceed sa pinaka-point ng book na ito, which is yung definition ng virtue. Aristotle first discusses the 3 states of the soul, to which we will later relate yung virtue. The first is emotions. He says that no one can be judged for their feelings as long as the reason is justified. For instance, an angry man cannot be said to be bad as long as there is justifiable reason for that feeling. Maaaring because of inexcusable behavior of another person towards them. The second state is capacities, and just like emotions, Aristotle says that no one can be judged for their mere capacity of a behavior or action, as long as they are able to control it. To illustrate this, a man cannot be labeled bad just because of his capacity to feel extreme anger, as long as he is able to control himself from exhibiting this behavior when not necessary. And the third state of the soul is dispositions or states. Here, Aristotle says that a person cannot be judged based on their tendency to certain feelings or actions. For instance, someone prone to anger or one who gets angry with little provocation is bad. Because of this, Aristotle says that virtue must then be dispositions, as we can be judged for how we act, whether an action or behavior is right or wrong. Following this idea, a good disposition is defined as one that makes a person do good and causes him to perform his function well. Moral virtue is then the disposition or tendency to act morally in accordance with our reason and feel feelings, both pleasure and pain, accordingly. More so, moral virtue is accomplished by aiming at a middle ground or mean between two extremes or vices, excess and deficiency. However, it is important to note that morality is not entirely at the center, but it changes relative to every individual. What Aristotle says as the mean is not the same to every individual, but one as to what a rational person will identify it to be. In the book, Aristotle explains this idea using an athlete. When the mean is said to be the same for every athlete, then that would suggest that 6, the mean between 2 and 10 pounds of food, is the amount of good to be eaten by every individual. The mean relative to the person suggests that different athletes require varying amounts of food, and it cannot be said that the one who requires more servings is a glutton, an excess of the right amount. He says that the mean is reference to how an ideally rational person would put it. The following are conditions in their related mean, excess, and deficiency. This was discussed further in books 3 and 4 of Nicomachean Ethics, which we will not cover today. As Aristotle ends Book 2, he gives advice on how to find the middle ground of any situation or condition. He says that 1, we must avoid the extreme and most opposed to moderation. Number 2, we must examine our own natural tendencies and be wary of the vices that tempt them. And number 3, let us be aware that everyone is biased towards pleasure, whether virtuous or not. In essence, Book 2 defines moral virtue as a mean between extremes, which is responding appropriately to both pleasure and pain. It is a disposition to act morally in accordance with reason, and it is a learned characteristic that we form through habits.
And now, let's proceed to the final book of the Nicomachean Ethics. Some people think pleasure is the ultimate good, but some also think that pleasure is evil. But Aristotle argues that these are inaccurate arguments, as these are based on just actions and feelings rather than facts, which is the basis of true statements. Pero sa inyo ba? Do you think that the purpose of life was to enjoy it as much as possible? Kasi diba meron tayong sinasabi na YOLO or you only live once, kaya you really do things that makes you feel what you perceived as happy. This is what hedonists, famous pleasure-seeking philosophers, believed in. And so, Aristotle ends the book with the concept of pleasure, because it is perceived that the virtue of character holds great significance in enjoying and hating the right matters. Realistically speaking, ang isang tao mas gugustuhin nilang piliin yung mga bagay na makakapagbigay sa kanila ng pleasure at iiwasan or hindi gagawin ang mga bagay na makakasakit sa buhay nila. Sino ba naman kasing gugustuhin masaktan sa sarili nila unless martyr ka sa pag-ibig, di ba? Kaya nga si Eudoxus, a member of Plato's Academy, ina-argue niya na ang pleasure ay ang kinoconsider na supreme or chief good because we desire it as an end in itself and it makes other good things more desirable. Pero si Aristotle naman, kinoconclude niya na ang pleasure in and of itself isn't the ultimate good, but is rather associated with the chief good. Kasi hindi lahat ng pleasure na nararamdaman ng isang tao ay kaaya-aya or tama, at meron din namang mga pleasure na dahil sa mabubuting bagay. Pero the thing is, Eudoxus, although not a hedonist, noticed a connection between pleasure and choice. Ika nga ni Aristotle, humans will usually choose pleasure over pain. But, in-emphasize rin niya na pleasure is not a process, but something that is complete at any time. It is not a process or becoming kasi pleasure can vary, especially since pwedeng iba-iba tayo ng level or quantity of pleasure na nafe-feel sa isang bagay. Or you need to be something in order to feel the pleasure associated with it. Like for example, you need to be a teacher in order to feel a teacher's pleasure. Or sa akin, I need to be a UP student in order to feel an eskolar ng bayan's pleasure. So, it can be instant, complete, and full at any time. With that, I'll emphasize the word activity. Kailangan may activity na mangyayari at nangyari para ma-attain mo ang pleasure, pero hindi na siya nagko-continue. Thus, Pleasure is a completion or a consequence of an activity, but humans cannot be in a constant state of pleasure. Dahil for example, ang activity is na-promote ka sa trabaho. Tumaas yung sweldo mo at posisyon mo, so nagkaroon ka ng pleasure. Pero after mong ma-promote, mas matinding workload naman ang dumating at mas mabigat na responsibilidad yung napunta sa'yo. Kaya hindi na natutuloy yung pleasure na na-feel mo, which is yun yung pinopoint out ni Aristotle. Pleasure arises as a consequence or as a result of a certain enjoyable activity. He stated that most fully human pleasures are those which complete the activities of the complete and blessedly happy man. So dito, hina-highlight ni Aristotle yung kahalagahan ng attitudes ng isang tao about pleasures and pains for the development of virtue. Virtuous pleasures comes from a good activity, and base pleasure comes from a bad activity, just as good or bad desires lead to good and bad activities. Kaya nga hindi sa lahat ng oras ay dahil lang nakaramdam ka ng pleasure, mabuti or maganda na yun. But when people have a virtuous attitudes about them, they enhance one's happiness. And na-mention na usually in political science, happiness is considered the end of human striving. Pero alamin muna natin yung nature ng happiness in terms of Nicomachean Ethics. First, happiness is an activity and not a state. Ginagawa ito ng isang tao at hindi basta-bastang kondisyon na nagtutuloy-tuloy. It is choice-worthy in its own right. So, totoong happiness ang nafe-feel mo if hindi siya nakadepende sa iba. Self-sufficient yung desires mo without adding anything else. And the most choice-worthy activities for a person are those concerning with virtue. For them, lahat ng activities according with reason promote happiness. And take note that a virtuous life requires a focus on serious action. Kaya nga masasabi na kinokontra nito yung typical perception ng isang tao na ang happiness is associated with mere pleasure or amusement. Kasi amusement is a sort of entertainment or relaxation. And virtuous people do not live their life seeking amusement constantly. And sinabi ko nga kanina na happiness happens when there is an activity that is to be completed. Ngayon, baka may nakakurious na about this ideology kasi we all want to be truly happy, right? So, if happiness is the supreme goal of humans, what supreme virtue can lead us there? And so, in-emphasize ni Aristotle na given nga na yung happiness is activity na nagko-coincide with virtue, it must then accord with the supreme virtue, which is understanding, particularly na yung understanding of divine. Kaya ang greatest happiness ay makikita sa study. Yes, study, which is a contemplative activity that is considered to be most proper to a human being as we are capable of it. It meets all the criteria for action to bring complete happiness, considering na continuous siya and naglalast throughout our lives. Self-sufficient din at hindi mo kakailanganin ng ibang tao or bagay para mag-aral. As per Aristotle, study is something na ine-enjoy ng isang tao for its own sake and not as a means to an end. Nakaka-characterize ito by leisure or what some perceives as an opportunity afforded by free time to do something. And the more you pursue it, mas nagli-lead siya to self-nourishment, growth, and wider perception in life. Kaya mas lumalalim din yung pleasure mo the more you study. So, complete happiness is said to be found in this activity. Pero syempre, naniniwala din naman si Aristotle na study cannot be pursued alone or yun lang yung reason for true happiness. Meron din dapat tayong mga i-consider katulad ng good health and basic necessities. Pero not too much kasi sabi nga kanina, virtue is the mean. Hindi sobra, hindi magkukulang. Tulad lang din sa love yan. Kapag nagmahal ka nang hindi nagkulang at hindi rin naman sumusobra, most likely mas strong ang relationship nyo but you still have love for yourself. A balance, ika nga. And so, Aristotle suggests that someone who lives a life of study has a divine element in him. Mas nabibless kasi ng happiness ang mga taong virtuous dahil they have a divine understanding as they pursue study. And so, mas malapit sila sa mga divine gods and entities na nakakapagbigay ng true happiness. Kaya nga even though we are mortals, i-urge pa rin natin na mamuhay na naaayon sa mga immortal or divine beings or state. But understanding is also the controlling element of a human being. So dito pa lang, masasabi na natin na the life of study is the supreme and happiest life. To sum up, a person whose activity accords with understanding then would seem to have the happiest life and also to be loved by the gods, ayon kay Aristotle. Pero, Aristotle doesn't consider studying virtue enough. We should know how to act on the things we learn. Kasi for example, oo, alam mo nga kung ano yung virtue. Oo, napag-aralan mo siya at pinag-aaralan mo siya, pero hindi lahat ng tao na alam na ang virtue ay kumikilos na agad ng tama. Ilagay natin ito sa context ng one of the most controversial issues with a religious person, kuno. Ika nga ng mga meme, nagsisimba nga pero paglabas ng simbahan, nagiging masama pa sa masama. This was an issue kasi maraming nananalig sa bahay ng Diyos, pero paglabas ay daig pa ang hindi nagdadasal sa kasamaan ng ugali. And so, these are instances na makakapagpatunay na karamihan din sa mga tao ay nakokontrol ng feelings nila. Mas inaayunan ang nakakapagbigay ng pleasure at iniiwasan naman yung nakakasakit sa kanila. And if you lean more towards feelings and not reason, hindi talaga nila alam kung ano nga ba ang totoong pleasure. Hence, arguments alone cannot reform people with such ingrained habits. Kaya nga naniniwala si Aristotle na hindi lahat ng diniscuss niya about a virtuous life can be achieved by a lot of people. Kasi, mas nakasanayan ng tao to live according to their feelings instead of their reason. With that, we can say that nature plays a role in making people good or bad. Kaya nga sabi ng karamihan na kung ano ka ngayon ay dahil sa kinalakihan mo. Accordingly, meron ding effect ang teaching o pangangaral sa isang tao. Tulad nga kanina, nature and nurture. As per the book, the soul of any student needs to have been prepared by habit for enjoying or hating finely, like ground that is to nourish seed. After all, once na nasanay na ang isang tao to live according to his feelings, most likely hindi siya makikinig or kahit nga maintindihan ang isang argument. So what more pa i-persuade magbago sila, di ba? It is why, to attain virtue, we must already in some way have a character fond of what is fine and objecting to what is shameful. Pwedeng example dito yung problem na kinakaharap ng generation natin ngayon versus yung ideals ng mga tinatawag nating boomers. Meron silang mga values at paniniwala na nakasanayan na nila na more on based sa feeling of stereotypes nila. Nakahirap-hirap ipaintindi sa kanila yung mga mali sa mga yon dahil nga nakasanayan na nila ito sa paglaki. Diba? And so, Aristotle pointed out that in order to become a virtuous human being, their soul already needs to have been prepared for virtue through acknowledging of what's choice-worthy and rejection of what's immoral. So ito, kinoconsider siya as soil of the soul.
And without its preparation, wala ring use yung mga arguments. However, if someone hasn't been raised according to suitable laws,
they cannot be molded in such a character. And so, laws must establish and regulate their upbringing and practice para kahit bata pa, one will grow up in accord with virtue and won't perceive it as distressing. Pero, hindi sapat kay Aristotle na basta sinunod mo na lang yung laws ng bata ka pa. There is this concept pa nga na one only acts like living by virtue because they have the fear of punishment if they did anything wrong or bad. Which is why Aristotle emphasized the importance of habituation to virtue, hindi lang sa pagkabata, kundi hanggang sa tumanda na ang isang tao, for them to really be accustomed. So laws are needed throughout life. Which is why legislators have the responsibility to encourage people to pursue virtue and strive for excellence, while also implementing corrective measures and penalties for those who disobey or lack the inclination to obey the laws. It is because, with proper upbringing, habituation, and adherence to virtuous practices, individuals can develop into morally upright individuals. Ina-acknowledge kasi din ni Aristotle na not all people can be positively influenced by the formative power of law, and those who are irredeemable should be excluded from society. Pero naniniwala siya na karamihan sa mga taong lumaki under a system of just laws, pwede silang mag-guide towards virtuous behavior, since a sound legal framework has a significant impact on shaping individuals' moral character and conduct. Aristotle then argues nga na kayang makapag-obliga ng law or laws in a way na hindi kaya gawin ng isang magulang or kahit pa nga ng teacher. So, a society should really need to pay attention to people's upbringing, di ba? And this highlights kung gaano kahalaga ang paggawa ng appropriate and relevant laws. And even though individualized attention is crucial for encouraging virtue in people, an understanding of universal principles is necessary, as goodness should not just be for a single being but for the whole. Kaya nga kung sakaling ikaw inaasa mo na maging mabuti ang mga tao, babalik tayo sa sinabi ko kanina, which is study. One needs to study legislative or political science, as this pursues legal frameworks and political systems. By doing so, padadetermine mo kung ano nga ba ang dapat mong i-impose, ano ang dapat mong gawin, ang dapat mong malaman na para sa ikabubuti ng lahat at makakapag-promote ng virtue within the society. Thus, Aristotle concludes his Nicomachean Ethics by proposing the study of legislative science, essentially a branch of political science, to establish societies focused on virtuous happiness and higher pleasures instead of base pleasures. So remember, pleasure is temporary as it results from immediate gratification. It can be from a bad or good activity, which makes it not the chief good. Meanwhile, happiness is a long-lasting state characterized by developing oneself to live up to high standards of behavior and achievement. Unlike pleasure, which is transient and tied to momentary desires, happiness stems from living virtuously throughout one's lifetime. To which I leave what we believe in. In our pursuit of happiness, pleasures might be blinding. Thus, let virtue be our compass, guiding us back to the path where true happiness resides.